Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us this evening. We appreciate very much your attendance. We had a good turnout, maybe I should say turn up on Sunday morning. And again, tonight already, we could see a little bit into the numbers and it looks like we've got a sizable number that have joined us. So very much appreciate you being here. Uh, we're living in these very unusual circumstances, but they say that there's a silver lining for every cloud. I'm hoping that with circumstances such as we're facing now, at least the families can draw somewhat closer together. Perhaps we're getting to know each other with a freedom of time and additional time that's stolen from us when we have such busy regular lives. And so, again, let's look on the upside, of course, always positively onward and upward with our God who is so very good to us. So we're in Titus. It's been a month, as a matter of fact, since I presented the last class. We're going to do a little bit of review here at the beginning. Hope that it won't take more than 40 minutes tonight. I'm going to try to limit myself to that amount. Let's see if I can get the slides turning here. There we go. So a month ago, last time we talked about Titus, we had gone through only most of the first chapter, saw in the first 4 verses a wondrous salutation. Paul's greeting to Titus in this letter is rivaled only by the Roman letter for fullness and for depth and its beauty. And so remember that about the letter to Titus, that this introduction we see in those first 4 verses is particularly lengthy and insightful. Verse 5 gives Titus a 2-point job description as Paul leaves him there on the island of Crete to set in order the things that remain and to appoint elders. Then in verses 6 through 8, we had the elders' qualifications. Any man that meets these qualifications should become an elder. Every man who doesn't should be working toward it, and that goes for every woman as well. This is just a list of things that qualify for all of us as virtues that God would expect of us. Then getting down to where we left off last time, we looked at verses 9, 10, and the first part of verse 11 at the elders' job description. That description reads like this. Once we find these qualified men, they accept the responsibility for being shepherds of the flock. They will be able, in verse 9, to do 2 things. Number 1, to exhort in sound doctrine. This is the elder's primary responsibility, to be a teacher, to be one who can elucidate the scriptures, explain them, teach, so that we are more knowledgeable and therefore more encouraged and more useful in the Lord's service. Number 2 in that verse, he has a responsibility to refute those who contradict. And then verse 10 intervenes. There are many rebellious men, empty talkers and deceivers, especially those of the circumcision, who must be silenced in the first part of verse 11. So this exhortation in sound doctrine and this refutation of those who contradict is because there are so many rebellious men and empty talkers and deceivers, especially among the Jews here in the days of the birth of the church, and they are to be silenced. It is God's will that the elders handle these men and bring these men to absolute silence. They are not to be permitted. Their opinions are unwelcome. Their teaching is unsound, and the elder's responsibility is to put an end to it. Now, that's the elder's job description. For this evening, and please note in yellow what I've highlighted there, in 9b, so we're going to be breaking into the middle of verse 9, and we're going to be stepping back a couple of verses from where we ended in verse 11 a month ago. We're now going to look at an unusual passage really in Scripture. We have it in Peter at even greater length, but rarely do you have such a lengthy discussion about the character and the nature and the activities of those who are the elders' enemies, the men that the elders are to put to silence. These are also, of course, the church's enemies. They are Satan's minions. They were there then, and they've been there ever since, and we will be confronting them as well. Satan is relentless. He's not about to just give up. He doesn't take vacations. And so these kinds of people exist to this day. And so tonight I thought what I would do is we kind of have to unweave the fabric of the way that Paul presented it. But I'd like to just take this night and look at this description of these enemies. See what we can learn about them and how they behave, preparing ourselves as men to become elders, preparing the women in the congregation to be useful with everyone that you meet. These kinds of people and their problems are not limited to male or female, and they're not limited to those that are teachers. These are people we're going to meet every day, and we need to know then who they are and then how it is to handle them. So we're going to step back a couple of verses tonight, look at the latter part of verse 9, and see if we can close out the chapter, which all of it mostly is revolving around here, these evil people. Now, first note that there are 127 verses in Proverbs, and I just did a quick search of the three terms evil, wicked, and perverse. There's 127 times verses that we have regarding these kinds of people. So God has always wanted us to understand these people. He has always been preparing everybody, not just the church's leadership, to handle these people. So it's really quite important that we're prepared for this. We can recognize them, and then we can take care of them at the level and to the extent that God would have each of us working with them. Take Proverbs 2, verses 11, 15, for instance. Discretion will guard you. Understanding will watch over you to deliver you from the way of evil, from the man who speaks perverse things. And with that first description there, try to remember some of these. You'll see them repeated when we get back to Titus, who speak perverse things, from those who leave the paths of uprightness to walk in the ways of darkness, who delight in doing evil and rejoice in the perversity of evil, whose paths are crooked and who are devious in their ways. Well, devious is another term that comes up as we're dealing with Titus chapter 1. Take Proverbs here now, 4 and verse 16. They cannot sleep unless they do evil. They are robbed of sleep unless they make someone stumble. So far beyond people who are just making a mistake, they misunderstand something, they mean well, but they don't know any better. These people, and I think there are very significant numbers of them, intend to do evil, lie awake at night thinking how they can do it more effectively. They're robbed of sleep unless not only they can be involved in some kind of evil activity, but that they're harming somebody else. They make someone else stumble. So even for those you think of in the world, who are just selfish and they don't care about the Lord or his word, and they're just going to live their lives the way that they want, this is something more. This is something different. This is our enemy. These are people who are seeking to destroy us. They want us to lose our faith. So it's extremely important then that we understand who they are, recognize them, and deal with them. Proverbs chapter 16, verses 27 and 28. A worthless man digs up evil, while his words are like scorching fire. A perverse man spreads strife, and a slanderer separates intimate friends. You're all familiar, of course, with what they typically refer to as Hebrew poetry, how it is that while in our English poetry we rhyme the sounds at the end of each line, they are rhyming thoughts, and so you get a repetition in Psalms especially and in Proverbs of a very same idea, just repeated in different words. This worthless man who digs up evil, his words are like a scorching fire. Well, the damage that the fire does is the strife, the slander, the destruction of the relationship between what once were intimate friends. All of this is the purpose lying awake at night to accomplish of these particular kinds of people. Last proverb, Proverbs 28, verses 4 and 5. Those who forsake the law praise the wicked, but those who keep the law strive with them. Evil men do not understand justice, but those who seek the Lord understand all things. When I get to the end of the lesson this evening, we'll be talking about to the pure, all things are pure. This is a very simple and similar idea right here. But those who keep the law, the start of that second line there of Proverbs, those who keep the law, brethren, do not just stand by. They don't just ignore it. It's not merely that we refuse to participate in it. Those who forsake the law praise the wicked, but those who keep the law, and that's us, strive with them. We enter into combat with them. We're wrestling with them. Our responsibility, not just the elders' responsibility, is to take this out onto the field of battle and see what we can do to silence this kind of behavior and these kinds of people. So let's go back to Titus. Look at chapter 1 now, last part of verse 9. I'm just going to list each of these. And as I say, we're going to go through these qualities of the evil men, skipping over some intervening information, and we'll come back at the end and bring all this together. But in 9b, as you can see there, last part of verse 9, he may be able to exhort in sound doctrine and to refute those who contradict. Now, brethren, I think there's more here than just the one idea that when the elder identifies somebody who contradicts sound doctrine, then the elder is to go and work with that individual, point out this contradiction, teach them what the truth is, and then put them to silence if they will not accept it. Prove publicly to everyone that this individual who contradicts is contrary to God's will, to God's revelation. Now, that's certainly the case. That's the case. I'm not saying it isn't so. I'm just saying I think there's a little bit more to this. How many of you have met people who are their nature immediately resist anything that you say? As I was preparing this lesson in the course now of several weeks, immediately two people leaped to my mind that I've known for years. And I'm sure people don't know who they are, but these are both members of the church. And it's been really interesting to me year after year as I've watched their behavior. They are faithful saints. I'm sure they have, every intention of doing the right thing. But when you say something to them, their default mindset is to immediately say no, to immediately try to point out that there's some error or flaw in what you've said. Instantly, they contradict. And I said, to immediately leap to mind. I've met plenty of people like this, and I think you have too. And it got to the point, it's kind of funny. I do this on purpose sometimes with people. When I identify somebody like this, I'll throw in something that I know they agree with, I know they believe, and it's kind of humorous to me when I make the statement and immediately they'll start their next sentence with something like, actually, which is their introduction to how wrong they think you are. And then I've watched them catch themselves a moment later and realize, oh, wait a minute, I believe that. So, brethren, let's learn ourselves first not to descend into that mindset. Nobody's wrong all the time. Lots of people in and out of the church have good, wholesome, helpful things to offer. The truth is the truth, no matter who it comes from. So those who contradict may have just this character flaw, but they're also choosing now to contradict God and his word and anybody, of course, who's trying to proclaim it. So that was pretty simple to go to. I think the rest of these mostly are as well. If you don't know by now what a rebellious person is in verse 10, I guess you're never going to figure it out. Certainly they're contradictors, but they're just naturally resistant to a program or to a way or to advice or to a system. It's not just the doctrine, but what you're asking them to do. Empty talkers. Empty talkers. Now, I've been watching televangelists just like you have for most of my life, and it's astonishing to me how they can stand up hour after hour after hour and remain so fully separate and apart from anything God ever said. Just spewing every opinion and psychologist's idea and book, that's the fad of the week, and all these illustrations, the concepts and principles that you can't find in scripture anywhere. but they make them sound good. And it's just empty talk. Never forget, I think it's John 12:48. We will give an account for every idle word we speak. God's people are supposed to be thinking first and speaking next, if at all. We are choosing our words that they never be empty, and they've first been tested to be sure that they are true. So these empty talkers can fill the airtime, but they're not feeding the minds of God's people or anybody else with truth. They are, as the last part of verse 10 shows us then, they are deceivers. And especially among the Jews are familiar with the law. They know the Old Testament. They're more capable of twisting it and abusing it and misusing it. And like Satan did in the temptation with Jesus, quoting from Psalms and then encouraging somebody to do something that was never God's intent from that particular verse or any other. So we've got these contradictors who are rebellious against God's will and everything else connected with it. They are empty talkers and deceivers in verse 11, who are teaching what they shouldn't for sordid gain. Now, obviously, there's two different ideas there. Hold on a second. I think I'm getting a question coming in from Michael. Mike, yes?
Yeah. As I was listening to this, question came to mind as to how do we distinguish between the ones that Titus is talking about here and those that Paul mentions in Romans 14?
Who are weak, as we studied on a Sunday morning here, what would be 3 weeks ago, I guess now.
Yes, the reason I bring that up is I see so many times that brethren get these two things mixed up, that they will jump all over those who are weak in the faith and sit quietly by when those who contradict the faith ramble on and on.
Yeah, I'm sure the answer is Matthew 7:1 to start with. Jesus says, "Judge not that you be not judged," and that, of course, is turned in the denominational world to I can believe and practice whatever I want. But then it's followed immediately after with "cast not your pearls before swine." God shows us in Scripture, one of the things we're studying tonight, who those evil people are. And he gives us the capacity to recognize a good tree from a bad tree by looking at the fruit. So yes, we can tell who they are. And I think probably the best answer to your question, though, is only if you spend time with these people, only if you engage them, only if you learn from their behaviors and judge their fruit to be able to find out if it's an honest mistake or if they're just empty talkers and deceivers. So it's a great question, and it may be difficult on occasion, but don't give up. This is a command from God for the elders, but we're going to find it all over Scripture. You know who the pigs are. Don't cast your pearls before them. But you can also recognize a Nicodemus in John 3, like Jesus did. You don't have to be inspired to see here's an honest inquirer. He's going to change his life as soon as he can understand it. Appreciate the question. Hope that helps. If not, send in part B of the question, and we'll press on here with verse 12. Now, you notice I got this in parentheses and italicized, and all of that. Now, please look at verse 12, because I think I really need to disabuse us of a common misunderstanding. One of themselves, a prophet of their own, said, "Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, lazy gluttons." Cretans are these things: liars, evil beasts. In the New American Standard, we'll talk about this term in a minute, lazy gluttons. What is a Cretan, and how do you spell it? So that when we say of somebody, he's a Cretan, we have an idea in our head what we're saying, but I'm afraid far too many people think that it's derived from this verse, and it's got nothing whatever to do with this verse. There's all the difference in the world between a Cretan, spelled A-N at the end in this verse, and a Cretan spelled I-N at the end, that is the more common word people use today, usually, as an insult or some sort of a judgment. So it's Merriam-Webster in this case. Cretan with an I-N, the one that is not in Titus. In Titus, it means a native or inhabitant of Crete. But that's not what we're talking about when we speak of somebody being a Cretan. We don't think they came from Crete. We're passing a judgment on their behavior. The definition of this Cretan, I-N, is stupid, vulgar, insensitive, a clod, or a lout. They're two totally different words, and this one with the I-N at the end is not derived from Titus 1. It's not related to Titus 1 at all. Here, continuing with Merriam-Webster, chronic iodine deficiencies in diet can result in malfunctions of the thyroid gland, which produces hormones necessary for normal human development. Some mountainous regions, parts of the Alps, do not naturally provide their inhabitants with a diet rich enough in iodine, and the resultant hypothyroidism causes stunted growth and mental retardation. And Franco-Provencal or Provincial or Provençal, or however you pronounce that with a little squiggly on the bottom of the C, the Romance speech of French Switzerland and adjacent areas of France. A person affected by hypothyroidism was called a Cretan, I-N, which literally meant in that language, wretch or innocent victim. When the word started out, it was not a judgment. It was not involving values. It was not about somebody's failure or misbehavior. They were innocent victims. The word, in fact, meant Christian, oddly enough, in that language, and emphasized the hypothyroid victim's basic humanity. So if you will, the term itself means Christian. Its figurative meaning was a wretch or innocent victim, apparently derived from the persecutions, of past time. But it's trying to emphasize the person's a human being like we are. It should evoke a sense of mercy and love and respect and grief, for their affliction. So, as Christians, we really are supposed to know what we're talking about. Let's lay this Cretan thing aside here. The one in Titus is somebody from the island. This one means stupid or vulgar or insensitive, and almost as an insult to that, it originally was derived from something wholly innocent, victims of, a dietary deficiency and therefore, serious physical and mental illness. Now, back to Titus, though, in verse 12. They are described as liars and evil beasts and lazy gluttons in the New American Standard and quite a few other translations. You know what a liar is? Somebody who's an evil beast acts like an animal rather than a human being. They're operating at, the lowest level. A little bit of information on your lazy gluttons there. Literally, it's not lazy even, and it's certainly not glutton. The idea that comes to our minds of a glutton, somebody who lacks the discipline to restrain their own eating, a glutton is not what the word means. It means belly, and it's only used one other time in scripture, and there it's translated womb. It's talking about a woman's belly when she's pregnant. So these idle bellies is not really the idea at all we get out of lazy glutton. They're idle, so they're doing nothing. You could ascribe laziness to that. But I think the heart of this particular description, and it is one harsh insult, is that they're nothing but useless eaters. It's like when we say somebody's just, wasting the air. They're idle bellies. They just consume, and they're good for absolutely nothing. This is the description of the islanders in general in Crete. So I'm going to skip it for a few minutes. We'll come back to it at the end. You can tell I'm racing. I've got a lot of stuff to get into 40 minutes here. So we'll come back to that idea in a minute. But verse 14, let's stick with these evil people for a moment, and we'll come back and see how to relate to them. Skip down then to verse 14. Not paying attention to Jewish myths and commandments of men who turn away from the truth. The first resistors of Christianity were the people to whom it was first sent, the Lord's people, the people who knew their Old Testaments. And these people turn away from the truth. They turn away from that truth to Jewish myths and commandments of men, Jewish or not, but they just don't want the truth. Now, brethren, we're all familiar with that. We know that if you make any effort whatsoever to bring the gospel to virtually anybody you meet, certainly out there at work and wherever else, the truth is demanding. The truth is singular. So you can't just have whatever opinion you want. The truth is so demanding that you can't reject it and be right or pass God's judgment in the end. The truth is unchanging. It is the truth. So it's not a matter what I think or somebody else thinks. No such thing as what's true for you is not true for me. But the heartbreak in all this, brethren, is that they're turning away from something that is in their best interest. And for some of them, it is the gospel they'd accepted, and now they're rejecting. Not necessarily rejected it from the outset, but they've embraced it. They've seen the glory of it. Hebrews, 2 Peter, we have these passages that talk about people who knew the truth and then, like swine, go back to the wallowing in the filth. So these individuals are not cretins. They're not stupid. They're not mentally retarded. They're not necessarily an individual who intends even to do this, but they hear that truth and it just doesn't appeal to them. So they're turning away from it. What is Titus' job? What is the elder's job? Brethren, if we're going to be the light of the world, what is our job? It's not to just stand idly by and let that happen. We can tell when somebody is not a Christian. That was a question we had earlier. It's not all that hard most of the time. Our responsibility is to manifest that truth, teach that truth, and persuade as best we can for people to come over to that truth. So sure, it's a list of things that Titus has to do as a preacher and that elders have to do as elders, but it's nonetheless a pretty high standard, I think, for all Christians as well. Verse 15. In verse 15, to the pure, all things are pure, but to those who are defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure. But both their mind and their conscience are defiled. So these unbelieving people have defiled their own minds, how they think, the way that they think, and their conscience, the ability to recognize that I'm doing an evil thing and it feels bad to me, so that they recoil, they step back from it instead of being drawn to it. The mind and the conscience now is corrupted. It's perverted. They're not functioning correctly. These are a people who are descending into the abyss. They are becoming incapable of recognizing what the truth is. They're turning into swine, who, when you recognize that, you don't cast your pearls before. But these unbelieving people have insisted on their unbelief for so long that the heart is hardening and hardening and hardening till the mind refuses or maybe can't even recognize the truth anymore. And the conscience doesn't feel bad. We all know the purpose of a conscience: make you feel bad when you're doing something you think is wrong. No problem. They are shameless. Nothing bothers them. And the truly great tragedy of the wonder that is the United States of America is the twisting of freedom into license, and the obsession with freedom to the point that we think it means we have a right to do the most despicable sins that God has ever forbidden. But when the mind and the conscience become this corrupt, they're not capable of responding to that gospel anymore. So unbelieving, corrupted minds and consciences, you give up on. In fact, in one of John's epistles, we're told not even to pray for them. That's a harsh judgment in itself, but to quit even praying for certain people when you recognize that they've come to this degree of resistance to the gospel. All right, now we'll take the last verse of the chapter, and then we'll step back to a couple of things that we passed over earlier. 16, they profess to know God. And our airwaves are filled with it. Churches on Sunday morning are filled with it. They profess to know God. I've said so many times, I wonder if it isn't true that more sin is committed on Sunday mornings than any other day of the week. Because this country has falsely assumed that it is a Christian nation. And because of their obsession with freedom, we have this proliferation of denominational churches, totally contradictory practices and beliefs that are being sold to our friends and neighbors in these United States as all of them true. Well, God demands that we worship him his way. God demands that we believe what he taught and not what some liar or evil beast or somebody with a defiled conscience, a rebellious, empty talker and deceiver has taught. On Sunday mornings, of course, I know the decline's been great in the last couple of decades, but on Sunday mornings, most of America still meets to do whatever they want in the name of God, to not do what God's asking them to do, to have developed a hardened heart that says, what I like, what feels good to me, must be pleasing to God. So I'm okay because I think I am, rather than I'm a person of faith who's doing what God is asking me to do. And so these people who profess to know God are denying his doctrine, denying the nature of all things in Scripture, and they don't know it. So whose responsibility is it to tell them? It's ours. Oh, it was Titus, it was the elders. But in so many other passages, brethren, it's ours as well. So they think they know God, but their behavior, their actions are a denial. And then comes this awful trio at the very end: detestable, disobedient, worthless for any good deed. Brethren, false doctrine, false beliefs, if you haven't the truth, if you've turned away from it, even the good things that you would be doing, nice and kind things the Bible would encourage, are still defiled by this mind and by this conscience. It does these things for different reasons, for different purposes than God intends. Okay, so it looks like my time is coming down just about right. There are two verses that I want to get to before I close off here. I've got just a few more minutes. So I skipped over 13 and I skipped over 15. Please, let's look into those. They're not directly about these evil people. Well, I guess they are, but from a different standpoint rather than descriptive and identification. Let's come back to verse 13 and these Cretans again. There's been just an enormous amount of controversy here when Paul says, this testimony is true. So verse 12's testimony: one of those Cretans, a prophet of their own, said, Cretans are always liars, evil beasts, idle bellies. This testimony is true. Now, I've, through the years, heard quite a few people who've tried to blunt, I think, the import of this statement. And they've found sort of figurative ways that, around it. when an inspired apostle says this testimony is true, that prophet of theirs, who probably had nothing whatever to do with Christ, I mean, he wasn't a prophet of God, this false prophet still yet has said a true thing. Not anybody is wrong all the time. He has said about his own people, the kind of folks that we are. And the testimony is true. Now, brethren, this is scary. You know, I'm out on the airwaves and anybody can listen to this, and I understand the climate we have in America. But there are social differences. There are even racial differences. There are differences in wide varieties between men and women, between young and old. There's all kinds of differences between people. And you always take on the character of those that you associate with. Particularly on an island, you know, there develops a society that takes certain things as acceptable, that has a way of doing things, and everybody fits in. They got used to it. They grew up with it. These Cretans were a particularly intransigent kind of people. They're just hard-hearted. They have more sin in their lives than other places. Corinth gets accused of this, and rightly so, all the time. Philippi was apparently a better town, a military town, by the way, seemed to have higher values than some other cities. So nobody's a racist who recognizes differences between certain types of people. And nobody's a racist for looking at Crete in the first century and says, this is what Cretans are. That's just seeing the fact of the matter. That's just observation. But please note, this is so important that we get this. The testimony was true. So reprove them, reprove a people who are like this, reprove these guys who are always lying, evil beasts, lazy bellies, reprove them severely. With that kind of person, you have to stand up taller. With that kind of person, you got to lean in on this. With that kind of person, you've got to get insistent. With that kind of person, if you want to have any hope of helping them, the reproof needs to be severe. It's got to be strong. It's got to be intense. It's not going to work otherwise. And he says so, that they may be sound in faith. Now, brethren, you reap what you sow. There's a consequence for every action. If people are this corrupt, your only hope is to be much more direct and stronger. And this is what Paul is now calling these elders to. You don't ignore it. You engage it. You don't allow it. You silence it and forbid it. And you do so with the individual and in their face, if you're to have any hope at all. And that goes contrary, I think, to just absolutely everybody's natural inclinations, whether you're obsessed with freedom in the USA or not. I know it's hard, but for those elders, they had to get over it. Titus had to teach it. And I think we need to step up to that plate a bit more often too. This doesn't have to be, you know, an obnoxious kind of an individual who runs around criticizing all the people all the time. It's, you know, you don't have to be obnoxious. But when you're dealing with a congregation who's got this kind of false doctrine and these kind of hearts that are so corrupt, you got to take care of it. You just have to step up. The elders do. Now, verse 15. To the pure, all things are pure, but to those who are defiled and unbelieving, nothing is pure, but both their mind and their conscience are defiled. Now, this is a easy thing, I think, to misunderstand. He's not saying that all things that are evil become pure if you're pure. Contradiction and impossible. But I think, and we have this in other places, and I'm out of time, but what the scriptures teach is that God tells us what is right and proper. God tells us what is pure, and the pure recognize it as such. To the pure, all things of God, all things that are spiritual, all things that are biblical, all things that are in God's divine revelation, those things are pure. We recognize them for what they are. But to those who are defiled and unbelieving, they look at God's word and nothing is pure. They see it as being an obstacle that needs to be overcome, a threat to what is right. So many laws in the United States, we've all watched it with dismay over the course of these last decades, that are being passed to turn the worst of sins into the highest of rights. It's a corrupting country. We're unbelievers by and large in this nation, the great majority. And this corruption, this perversion, this defilement of mind and conscience results in looking at the most beautiful things God's ever said. And because you're defiled and unbelieving, you can't recognize it as pure. Nothing is pure because their mind and their conscience are defiled. They are no longer capable of recognizing what is pure and what is not. What's your only hope? The left side of that slide. Your only hope is to reprove such an individual severely that they may be sound in faith. I can't speak for the odds and what your chances are, but pretty low they may be. If there's any hope, then brethren, Titus is being taught by an inspired apostle to teach those elders, you guys got to rise up. You've got to do the whole gamut, the full spectrum. You can start with the gentlest of admonitions, but if nothing works, you've got to come to the most severe of reproofs, if there'll be any hope. Okay, well, thank you all so very much. I am perfectly on time, so I'm going to close off right now. We truly appreciate you being here. We know it's kind of awkward for you as well. Pray God that this will pass soon. We can get back to the assemblies that he would have us in. I understand Michael Franklin has some final comments, and he'll be leading us in prayer. So until next time, go with God, and God will be good.